Let me give you a horror story. Okay, you find yourself at Mass. You got to turn on your Ignatian imagination here. You find yourself at Mass, and a visiting priest is here covering the Mass, and he changes the words of consecration. Is the Mass valid? Is the Eucharist valid at that point? That's one example, and that's a real story that happened to me more than once about liturgical abuse. Isaac sends in this question from Jamestown, New York. Says, I've heard the phrase liturgical abuse brought up in the show multiple times, but I have no idea what that means. Can you explain it to me, Father? What exactly constitutes abuse? Father, any other examples to explain this situation that we find ourselves in?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot of them. And that's a good question, Isaac, because sometimes we talk about things and throw out terms and we just assume everybody knows what we mean, but it's a great question. There's no dumb questions. So I hope that more people will bring things up about things they hear and don't know the definition or don't understand. It's not dumb. Everybody was kind of there at one time. So this question about liturgical abuse ties into the whole reason why and how we worship God. We worship God because he has told us that he wants to be worshiped, that he's made us to worship him, and he tells us how to worship him. In the Old Testament, he was very specific. When Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he received not only the 10 Commandments, but 600 and some other laws, many of which were liturgical, in which he was very exact about how he wanted Israel to worship him. Not just whatever they felt like, not whatever just made them feel good. He said, no, you will do these sacrifices, you will pray these psalms, and you will do these certain things. And throughout history, God has prescribed what he wanted done. When Christ founded his church, he too gave the authority to the apostles to carry on what he taught them. And part of that was how to worship him in the Mass. The Last Supper was the first Mass, and it was very specific. He based it actually, or he put it in the context of the Jewish Passover, which also was extremely exactly regulated, exactly how they were supposed to gather every year to commemorate the deliverance from Egypt, the lamb that had to be prepared, how it was to be prepared, how there were supposed to be a certain number of people there, what certain people like the head of the house said, and maybe the youngest member of the house and so on. It was all very specific. Nothing could be left over. The bones could not be broken. So when Christ came, all of those old laws no longer applied. The 10 Commandments still apply, but the specific liturgical laws no longer applied. Now the new law is what we follow. And we know because God tells us through his church. So we have a specific way that God wants to be worshiped. And in the Mass, the church tells us specifically what is to be done to worship God. There are things in what are called rubrics. That comes from the Latin word for read. And it's because in the altar missal, the directions for the priest of exactly what he's supposed to do are in red, and the words he's supposed to say are in black. And so a priest is bound to follow the rubrics. Now, in the traditional Latin Mass, there's no options. It's very clear. You do this, you say this, and that's it. You don't add something, you don't ad lib. In the Novus Ordo, in the rubrics, it says you say this or other similar words. So I guess in the Novus Ordo, there are some options, but there's not options on everything. There's certain things that have to be done for a valid Mass. And so whenever a priest goes off script, you might say, and does something that is against the rubrics or is not prescribed in the Mass, or as Rudy gave the example, makes up words or changes the words of consecration, which would be something where there are no options, there can't be options, then that would be considered a liturgical abuse, because we are abusing the way that God wants to be worshipped. A priest is bound to follow what the church says. And I think it's easier to do that in the traditional Mass just because there are no options. But even in the Novus Ordo, where there are options, he can say this or he can use his other words. That only applies at certain times, certainly never the consecration. I would say, Rudy, just to get back to your example about the changing the words of consecration. So St. Thomas actually talks about this. And St. Thomas says that the words have to be followed. It would be very sinful to just change the words on your own accord. But St. Thomas gives the example that if the priest accidentally, for instance, in the Latins, this was the Latin for the consecration, the first consecration is hoc est enim corpus meum, for this is my body. He said if the priest accidentally said haec est enim corpus meum, which changes the gender of that pronoun this, he said it would not invalidate the Mass. But if he added words that would change the meaning, like this is a symbol of my body, then it would certainly be an invalid consecration. I only mention that because sometimes people think if the priest misspeaks or mispronounces or has such an accent that the sound of the word changes, that maybe it's invalid. No, St. Thomas says, no, that's not the case. Having said that, a priest is never to change even one word of the Mass purposely.